Hi, everyone. It's Suzanne Gundersen of Transformed Connections, where I offer stress resilience solutions to be able to empower people to manage stress. So I'm joined today with my colleague, Leckey Harrison, and we want to talk to you about what it takes to heal your trauma. And that trauma could be a little T or a big T, and we're going to talk about the differences between the two. So Leckey, please introduce yourself.
My name is Leckey Harrison. I am the owner and chief everything officer of RaiseYourResilience.com. And I teach people how to naturally heal themselves of their trauma, which in effect is going to teach you how to manage stress by having a better relationship with your own neurological states. So that is it in a nutshell.
Wonderful. So today's topic is so important in the context of people waking up these days to their trauma. And trauma seems to be a word that people aren't afraid to use anymore. They're actually embracing it to understand that they've got trauma in their body. And we know from our studies that, trauma is a part of life that we have to go through in order for us to expand into deeper levels of connection with ourselves and to be able to grow in the world for ourselves and be of service to other people. So I'm glad that people are open to the word trauma these days. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, what it takes to heal trauma. I mean, it's such a big word. How do we first unpack that word a little bit and help people digest it to understand, where they're at on the spectrum of trauma? What do you use?
I use a definition I created. I created one for stress and one for trauma. And trauma is the wound that's created in the body by unaddressed stress cycles that then work themselves back into the spirit, the mind, the emotions. There's a lot of words you could use for that. And theoretically, that's only an expansion of a definition that Peter Levine uses. So stress is the root of that, and that's an autonomic cyclical, I believe is the way it's pronounced, autonomic neurophysiological strain on body resources that's demanding a physical engagement. So when the stress cycle begins, it wants to end. That's how we are wired. When it accumulates, which is a word you used in our last video, that's exactly what happens. That accumulation of unaddressed stress cycles is what creates this wounding because it disrupts everything. The immediate threat may have left the room, but as Porges would say, that does not mean you feel safe. So as long as your body still feels threatened, doesn't matter about anything else, it will eventually stay in that state and become trauma.
True. It's like when you wake up from a dream. I mean, is it real or imagined? You're still reacting to it, right? So,
Yep.
So we have these states of stress, and then when that stress is compounded and accumulates, it begins to overwhelm. That's when, and it doesn't get resolved. That's when we can have trauma that's living in the body because stress is not out there in the world. Trauma is not out there in the world. It's what happens to our body, and it's very unique to us. It's not, stress and trauma are very relative terms. I mean, one person's paper cut is another person's broken finger. It really, you just can't compare the two. They all are just very unique. So you and I both use the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test as part of learning where people may be at on that spectrum between an overwhelm, an accumulated overwhelm, and a trauma wound that may be inside, somewhere stuck in the body. So the ACE test has been around for quite some time. It's about 10 questions that really asks about different experiences you may have had in childhood that you score 1 point for each question. And I'm going to share my screen really quick because I do have a great example of this. You get 1 point for each question that you answer yes to. So here are the questions of the 10 questions that are out there. And you can find this online if you Google it. I'm not going to keep this up here too long on this page, but if you just look for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test, it's 10 questions, yes or no questions. For every yes question, you give yourself 1 point. And so with that, I know you and I both invite our potential clients to take this test to be able to help us understand where they may be at on that spectrum of trauma. And from there, be able to really help provide some direction on what the best approach may be for helping to resolve that trauma. And there are traumas that are, I mean, all trauma is in the body. And so we always want to, you and I always want to start in the body and start working through the motion of the body and being able to build that flexibility in the body to be able to allow for other levels of discovery to be safely perceived by the emotional part of our brain and the thinking part of our brain, which really we don't have access to when we are really in that primitive stress response. So our tools really begin and work within the body and the somatics of the regulation of the nervous system and being able to create, safe states of connection. And how we do that is we find a kind of a number on that scale of 0 to 10 of that test that we invite people to take as to where we feel like we're best be able to be suited to help those people using the tools that we know. I'd say my number is probably about number 3 or 4, depending on people. So if you come to me with a score of 3 or 4, or up to 3 or 4, it would be a really great fit for us to work one-on-one together. Anything above number 4, I certainly can still work with you, but I would recommend strongly that there would be, a licensed mental health professional that you're working through on some of the emotional and mental struggles that you may be having as a result of your trauma as well. And likewise, invite you that if you're already working with somebody on those emotional and mental struggles, and you're really intrigued about trying to work on it from a neuroscience perspective and the neurobiology of your nervous system, that we work together and being able to kind of give you a holistic type of approach for you. So what are your thoughts on that, Leckey? Do you have any other?
I think, I say, and I think the A-score people say that anything over 4 is considered high, which is out of 10, 40% being high. That's like say the majority, but in this case it is. And interestingly enough, I find that a lot of people don't quite understand what trauma is. And I use the Holmes and Ray Test also as an assessing tool. And it was created in 1968. So it includes nothing about that's on the ACE test.
Mm-hmm.
But what it is, it's much bigger. I think it's closer to 50 questions. But it covers things that a lot of people don't consider to be stressful events. And if you have it is a dynamic number, because you could take it 1 year, be nice and low. Their point was, if you have a high number, you're going to be more prone to disease. If you have a low number, you're okay. And so that could be dynamically changing. How many people are going to die in your life, in 1 year's time that are related to you? In some people's cases, that's a lot. For the most part, your parents get old, finally die. So it's a smaller number. But when you start compounding things like people dying, people getting diseases, moving, losing a job, getting a job, starting a relationship, ending a relationship, well, suddenly your stress factors are going to get really, really high. And that's one of the things that I like about the Holmes and Ray test, is it brings us, apart from all the stuff with the sexual or the childhood abuse and neglect, which is left out, all of these other things in life that can create issues for us. And it is still those issues that create this body response that begin to accumulate in the body that turn into a wound. It turns into the skeptical mindset. If I think about my own parents and how fairly middle class they were, who had been through World War II, got the PTSD, then they have the stressors of life, and suddenly all this little T stuff starts to add up. They start drinking. They still have their addictive behaviors of smoking, because that's how they dealt with the war, so forth and so on. Oh yeah, diseases dropped my mother at age 53, massive coronary. And actually, I think it was a blood pressure issue. But regardless, I mean, they're so closely related. She's dead. No matter what I want to call it, she's gone. And so the skepticism about life, and they grew up and they were the older generation to us hippies, and we were looking at them and saying, "You're plastic people," and they were looking at us saying, "You're fucking idiots." That's how it worked. But as time went on, people change, but still these events create the stress response in us that we don't recognize. And it wasn't until, even Freud ran away from the whole sex abuse thing, but recently with the ACE test, we're starting to say, okay, this is huge because the cohort for the ACE test was huge, and we need to address this.
Yeah, the cohort for the ACE test was, I think, over 100,000 people, and they said, 1 in 8 people had a score over of number 4, and that was back in 1985. So, that was a long time ago, and I can only imagine how much higher that number is today. And this is why I think people are more open to embracing their traumas now as being something that they talk about, as opposed to, oh, that was that thing that happened to me when I was younger, but it doesn't really affect me now. If your body went through a stress response that is since unresolved, and you've been living with that wound inside of you, whether it's through a memory that you have or a memorization in your nervous system of how to behave a certain way, or a symptom that you experience, then you're holding on to a trauma. Now, it might not impact you in a big T way, meaning big letter T trauma, or a little t trauma, because each of us have different resilience levels to be able to manage life. And certainly life does help us resolve our stress in certain capacities with relationships and experiences that we have. But yeah, there's more than just, abuse from childhood that could contribute to us having those little T or big T traumas, like you mentioned. So I'm glad you used that other test as well to be able to look at a broader spectrum of all the different types of life experiences. You could have been yelled at, in the 2nd grade and wet your pants, let the spelling bee, and it's a trauma to you. You could have had, some other type of a sexual inappropriate encounter with a child giver or somebody else, and that could equally be the same type of trauma to the other person. It's all relative. It really truly is. So in terms of, finding the healing path for any individual trying to, embrace their trauma and move on a healing transformation journey, we like these tests to be able to give us kind of a guideline where you may be at in your spectrum, and then always recommend that, if you're high on any one of these tests, meaning if you're a 4 higher than ACE, I'm not quite sure what the number is on your other test, Leckey, but certainly taking a look at getting the right type of counseling that you might be needing in conjunction to and complementary to the work that we do, which is to help the body, reset and retrain back to baseline, as opposed to staying in that wounded place of that trauma. And yes, it absolutely is 100% possible for the body to unwind those tension patterns and be able to downregulate back to places of peace and safety again. And then for us to help you train the body to anchor that safety, and being aware and orient exactly how to notice what those levels of stress are, and how to regulate them.
That's correct. One thing I'll say is that the path to healing trauma is the word discharge. If you don't discharge, you will not heal. Plain and simple.
Right.
That's how the body gets rid of it. And that's...
Some people use the word integrate, some people use the word process, but what, Leckey, I think you're trying to say here is that there's some type of overwhelm that gets accumulated, and that we need to then discharge that overwhelm. And how we discharge that overwhelm doesn't mean that we're actually going to pick something up out of our body and remove it. We're not like physically removing something, but we're helping our body, come down off of that overcharge. Yep. And discharge it within the stress response.
Yep. It gets rid of the accumulation.
Exactly.
That's how it happens. And that's, once you get rid of the accumulation, the body will heal it. It will integrate itself. Yeah. It will heal itself. It does all kinds of things all on its own. You got to get rid of the backlog, and that discharge is the way to do that. Whether you help that with other things is kind
Right.
of an organic type of thing. Each person, I did not. And so some people might need it. They might need medications, but I think for most people, a
Mhm.
natural path is very, very achievable.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, Leckey, for having this conversation with me today. And I hope everybody listening found some value in it. If so, I really would love to read your comments below or any questions that you have. As we each mentioned to you, we've got programs to be able to help you to discharge that overwhelm in your body, whether you have a little T or a big T. We can work with you alongside of your therapist. Or if you are somebody who's already gone through that and wants to do some work specifically on the neuro states of your body, please look us up. So again, thanks
Yep.
for listening, and we'll see you on the next video. Bye, everybody.
See ya.